So, to start off part three, if you will, of period two, I wanted to address specifically the 13 original colonies by their regions. And so I'll start from the north and work my way towards the south. So, starting off with New England. Keep in mind, a lot of times the English colonies get lumped together with that early part of Jamestown from Virginia, which I'll talk about later. But then also, we are looking at more New England first because these were the first locations for the English settlements after Jamestown. So, starting off here, talking about the Puritan colonies that were very religiously based, you have Plymouth Colony. So, Plymouth Colony is founded in 1620 by separatists. Now, they are also known as pilgrims, and you can use the terms interchangeably without a problem. Keep in mind, the separatists and the pilgrims wanted to kind of break away from the Church of England or the Anglican Church. And they found themselves going to Holland first, and then they left Holland when they had economic problems there and cultural differences. So then they came to America. Arriving in America around 1620 aboard the Mayflower. We are obviously all familiar with the Mayflower Compact, and keep in mind that it was your rationale for colonization. Like, why did they want to form their own colony in the New World? And also the idea of community ideal of working together. Now, the Pilgrims did face a very hard first winter because they were not prepared and you had a lot of deaths. But then they ended up receiving some Indian help, and think, your traditional Squanto and Thanksgiving Day celebration and things like that. And then the Plymouth became under new leadership of Governor William Bradford. And Plymouth was able to succeed at this time because they relied on fish, furs, and timber. So then you have the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this is going to be the Puritans, founding them in 1630. And they were founded by John Winthrop. And he called Boston, for example, the city upon a hill. And he founded other cities within there, like Salem, that we'll talk about more later. Now, as a side note, there is going to be something called the Great Migration in the 1630s. And it's where you had an English Civil War going on, and it drove thousands of people to America at this time. So then, taking a look at Rhode Island. Um, Rhode Island was founded by Roger Williams. Because Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth were very strict on Puritan beliefs and religious ideology. Roger Williams, who was a Puritan minister, he believed, though, that the individual conscience was beyond the church's control. And because of those beliefs, he ended up getting banished. So he goes and founds Providence, Rhode Island in 1636. He did treat the natives pretty well. He actually paid them for their land. He did allow for religious toleration in Rhode Island, so that meant Catholics, Quakers, and Jewish people could actually practice freely. Now, another person that's oftentimes associated with Puritan descent is going to be Anne Hutchinson. And she's the one that believed in antinomianism. And that's the idea that faith alone and not deeds could lead to salvation. Now, eventually, Anne Hutchinson left Providence and she founded her own little area in Rhode Island. And then from there, ended up going to Long Island. And that is where she was eventually killed by Native American tribes. In 1644, the king did eventually grant Rhode Island its own individual charter. And so places like Portsmouth, Rhode Island, and Providence could unite together. So then we have Connecticut, which was founded in 1636 by Thomas Hooker, and he had led a group of Bostonian Puritans to Hartford, Connecticut. Some things that make Connecticut in general unique is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which said that there would be a representative government with a popularly voted legislature and governor who is chosen by that legislature then. Now, you also have New Haven, founded in 1637, and eventually all of these areas, kind of like identified as Connecticut, were united together in 1665. So then you have New Hampshire. New Hampshire, pretty simple, 1679. It was originally part of Massachusetts Bay Colony, but then separated because the crown wanted more royal authority and control over the colonies. So, overall, let's talk about the New England colonies. Keep in mind that politically, there was a majority rule in Plymouth that established duties and powers through the Mayflower Compact and that idea of community working together. There was a representative government in Massachusetts Bay Colony where the freemen of the church could participate in yearly elections. Overall, keep in mind that a lot of stuff was controlled by the male property owners, and you may have some of these democratic ideals from some of the locations like Rhode Island, Connecticut, but there was still that element of anti democratic ideas like slavery. Now, there is the Puritan work ethic that you should recognize, and that's that all family members would end up working together. There were relatively few migrants that came to New England as laborers compared to like in the middle and the southern colonies that had more the indentured servants, the head right system. And in a way, it was kind of smart because what New England essentially assured was that future generations of kids turning to adults would then have employment opportunities. A big part of their economy in New England was going to be shipbuilding and based on timber. They do have a high literacy rate because of reading and writing and worshiping in the Bible. And on the note of religion, so keep in mind the Puritans are a group of people that wanted to purify the Church of England. And they wanted to get rid of the Catholic based rituals and the ornaments of the Church of England. And so then you have eventually, like, they had this idea of the belief of the supernatural, as did many people at the time. But keep in mind, it goes against the ideas of enlightenment that are some of the new ideas coming out from Europe. And the Enlightenment was the age of reason and thinking. But the Puritans believed that a lot of stuff, the economic hardships, the Native American wars, the problems in their society, were signs from God. And that's where you see, for example, like in Salem in 1692, the economic issues, the Indian Wars kind of flaring their ugly heads. And the people in Salem ended up executing about 19 people. So, still on the note of religion, let's talk about later on in 1660s, the halfway covenant. Because this is a new generation, you know, you have your first wave 1620s, 1630s, and now it's like their kids, their grandkids. So you have this new generation of Puritans that don't believe strictly in religion. They're less committed to it. And the church was losing some of its influence and power, and so they agreed to do what was called the halfway covenant. And that was that you could participate in church services and activities without your complete and total declaration of your belief in Christ. So you also have your relations with the Native Americans. I had mentioned that in Rhode Island, Roger Williams had paid the Indians for their land fair and square, but that wasn't the case for everyone. There were early treaties of peace with the Indians in 1620s and in the 1630s. For example, the Wampanoag in Plymouth had a peace treaty. The Narragansett and Mohegan in Massachusetts Bay had peace treaties. But then you have problems like in Connecticut along the Mystic River in 1637. There was the Pequot War, and the settlers ended up massacring all but a few, kids and women along the Indians there. You also have King Philip's War, which is known as the Metacom War in 1675 to 1676. And at first, in King Philip's War, what ends up happening is actually the Indians take over the settlers and almost push them completely out of their area. However, the colonists allied themselves with others and ended up pushing back on the Indians, and then did this huge, like, vilifying campaign of all Indians as bloodthirsty savages. So then, last, you have the New England Confederation, which was formed in the 1640s by the New England colonies. And this was for a common defense and ideology against Indians, Dutch, and French threats. The idea was that you had two representatives per colony, and they could act on certain things like boundary disputes between each other, runaway servants to return them, and also how to handle Native Americans. However, eventually in 1684, the New England Confederation did disband, but it did set a precedent for the colonies with their unified action. Hello, let's go ahead and talk middle colonies. So the middle colonies are going to be represented by New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. So starting off with New York, because it's a little bit bigger and more complicated. So remember that New York was originally called New Amsterdam by the Dutch, and it was founded in 1624. And the Dutch basically founded New York for commercial reasons. And they had relatively peaceful relations with the Indians, except when the Indians then threatened Manhattan Island, which the Dutch had used as a main import-export location. And this is where you actually get the nickname Wall Street from, because the Dutch had built up a wall in lower Manhattan Island to protect against pirates and invading Native American tribes on that area. But eventually, what ended up happening is the Dutch ceded New York to the English. And this was the Duke of York, who was the brother to the King of England at the time. And the Duke of York, took his navy and took over the Dutch from Peter Stuyvesant. Now, the Dutch that were still in New York were treated well. They were allowed to stay, were allowed to worship freely, were allowed to speak their own language. Eventually, the Duke of York did order some financial changes, some new taxes, for example, some new rent, that type of thing, and the New Yorkers were absolutely furious over it because they said, "Where's our representative government?" And so finally, in 1683, the Duke of York allowed the New York governor to have a representative assembly. In New Jersey, fun little fact, it used to be East and West Jersey, and so it was originally two colonies that were combined in 1702. But in New Jersey, the land was available for purchase. People could have relatively religious freedom. People could have a representative assembly. And don't forget that in New Jersey, two of the big cities that develop are going to be Princeton and Trenton, which obviously from the American Revolutionary War, major cities, major battle locations. So in Pennsylvania, this is founded in 1681 by William Penn. And it was a number of Quakers lived there, and it was nicknamed the Holy Experiment. Now, keep in mind, Quakers were people that practiced equality between men and women, nonviolence, and did not believe in military service. They also were different, though, than like the Puritans, because they believed that religious authority was within your own soul. And that's why Pennsylvania kind of became a refuge for the Quakers, because they were threatened in England. Now, the idea of this holy experiment is kind of three parts to it. William Penn wanted Pennsylvania to be this experiment, to provide that refuge for Quakers, to have liberal ideas in government, and of course to earn an income and profit for himself. Now, what also makes Pennsylvania unique is that they had a representative government elected by landowners. They did eventually have a written constitution that outlined freedom for worship and unrestricted immigration. And also they had good relations with the Native Americans within their colony. Delaware is real brief. Delaware had originally been part of Pennsylvania, but was eventually separated in 1702 into its own colony. However, the governor of Pennsylvania did oversee them until the Revolutionary War. Now, keep in mind, overall, for these middle colonies. The climate is going to be warmer than New England, which allows for better agriculture and farming. And these areas were known as the breadbasket because of the grains, particularly wheat, that they could grow. They did also have mining for coal and iron ore, and then they had rich forests, and so timber became an industry for them as well. Now, something interesting that's also different from some of the other colonies is actually all of these middle colonies are proprietary colonies, meaning they were owned by individual people, not directly owned by the crown. So you do begin to see some differences between these colonial regions. To show you the southern colonies, I wanted to start at the top of the southern colonial region with Maryland. Maryland was founded in 1634 by Lord Baltimore, who's also known as Cecil Calvert, just in case you ever see the last name Calvert. Cecil Calvert is Lord Baltimore's real name, British aristocracy. When you take over the title, take over the land, you take over the name as well. But as Lord Baltimore ruled Maryland, he did also institute the Maryland Act of Toleration in 1634. Since there were a number of Catholics and Protestants living in the area, and in order to create harmony between all the Christians, created this Act of Toleration. And basically, there is the question of, was it so tolerant or not? Because anyone who is not a Christian, you were not tolerated within Maryland. So then going down, I wanted to talk about Virginia and specifically start talking about Jamestown, since that's where it was initially founded. Now, if you've paid attention throughout these, you know that I'm going in geographic order, not so much chronological order. But for the English, in 1607, Jamestown was the first permanent establishment that they had done and created. There had been previously failed attempts like Roanoke Island, but Jamestown was the first royal colony that was successful. Now, Jamestown was, this is where you get John Smith, and this is where you get the phrase, he who shall not work shall not eat. And then ultimately, what saves the Virginia colony and Jamestown is going to be John Rolfe and the introduction of tobacco. And of course, if you think like the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, this is where you get Pocahontas and all that jazz. Keep in mind in Virginia, because of the tobacco plantations that are starting up, we need labor. And so in Jamestown, you will see indentured servants, and eventually that will shift to African slaves. Now, later on, as Virginia develops, there are going to be some problems. So like their economic problems dealt namely in the 1660s, because of low tobacco prices. Now, the colonists were annoyed by the low tobacco prices and blamed, London or the British, homeland, if you will. But in reality, it was probably due to overproduction of tobacco, which dropped the price. And so the House of Burgesses in Virginia, which is your representative government, did attempt to increase the price of tobacco, but London retaliated by raising prices on exports to Virginia. So ultimately, the Virginians ended up failing in that regard. The other problems revolve around Nathaniel Bacon and the political problems there. So keep in mind, Virginia was eventually ruled by Governor Berkeley. And Governor Berkeley favored the large planters and didn't protect the Western farmers from the Indians because he had some favorable trade relations with the Indians. So in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, with a volunteer army, raided different Indian villages. And Berkeley accused Bacon of rebelling against the royal authority, raised an army against him. Bacon burns Virginia, Bacon dies from dysentery, and then Lord Berkeley just manages to squash others. The big part about this, even though the rebellion you could say essentially failed, there are two big outcomes from Bacon's rebellion. One is the image of the wealthy landowners versus the landless or poor farmers, so economic problems. But then also you start to see this idea of colonial resistance to royal authority. So in 1663, the Carolinas were founded, and then they were eventually split north and south in 1729. So, North Carolina was small, sufficient farms, namely tobacco farms, and they had their strong sense of democratic rule and autonomy from British control, namely because of the farmers that founded them were like the backcountry from Virginia or from other areas who wanted their stab at success. Then in South Carolina, you have a lot more wealth concentrated there because of the plantations, like the rice plantations. And you also had really good harbors like going on in Charleston. And so South Carolina tended to be viewed as more successful, more important as well. And then lastly, we have Georgia. And Georgia is the very last English colony to be founded in 1732. And it was created as a buffer against the Spanish that were in Florida and the Indians as well, in order to protect wealthier South Carolina. Also, Georgia was founded as kind of a debtor relief because the prisons in England were overflowing with prisoners who owed money, and so ended up shipping them off to the new colony. In Savannah, Georgia, you have James Oglethorpe, and he is the one that had very strict rules against drinking, against using Africans for slavery. And ultimately, even through the time of the Revolutionary War, Georgia ends up being like the smallest as well as the poorest of all the 13 nations or colonies, excuse me.